Are men becoming more passive? Yes, it appears that in some sense they are. They're becoming more passive in that they're bailing out of society. The boys don't do as well in school pretty much from day one. They're less likely to enroll in university. They're more likely to drop out. They're less likely to graduate. They're withdrawing. And there is evidence that I think is quite compelling. Perhaps this is most advanced in Japan and South Korea, which have very low birth rates, that young men are even bailing out of the sexual game, even if it's solitary. There's some indication that young men aren't even masturbating as much as they used to. That's how emasculated and demoralized they are. And that's all a consequence of, that's all a consequence of this insistence that all manifestations of masculine will are part of the force that is not only a continuation of the historical pattern of power and oppression, which is, of course, what our society is entirely based on, but the purest manifestation of the destructive human force that's demolishing our beloved Earth. And, if you tell boys that from the time they're young, especially if they're actually ethical people, then, well, why wouldn't they be demoralized? Obviously, the right response to that, if it's true, is to be demoralized. But it's a pack of lies right from the bottom up to the highest levels of abstraction. I talked to a man named Marion Tupy the other day. He wrote a number of very good books, 10 Global Trends I think it's every educated person should know. I really like that book. He just wrote another one published in August of 2022 called Superabundance. And he calculated there's this idea, a Malthusian idea, that there's too many people on the planet and that we're going to hit some kind of limit of growth and then we're all going to starve. And that was really a big idea in 1967 with Paul Ehrlich, who believed that we were going to hit a population bottleneck by the year 2000, that there'd be starvation of hundreds of millions of people, and of course, and that commodities would shoot up in price and there'd be scarcity of everything. Typical Malthusian viewpoint, kind of based on analysis of yeast. If you put yeast into a medium, the yeast will multiply until there's too many yeast for the medium and then they all die. And that's a biological viewpoint, except only if you're simple-minded, because we aren't yeast and human beings are ingenious, which economists know perfectly well, because the economists always scrap with the biologists about this. And there's no limit to the extent of human ingenuity, and there are no obvious limits to prosperity and abundance whatsoever, assuming that we're not stupid. Marion Tupy and his co-author analyzed historical data looking at the relationship between population expansion and abundance, which is a positive relationship in that as there have been more people born, since there have been more smart and competent people born, which is a necessary consequence of that, we've got richer, not poorer. And the Malthusians say, yeah, well, the other shoe will drop eventually. It's like, yeah, specify your time frame, buddy. You don't get to have an infinite expanse to prove your hypothesis correct. It's like, well, human beings might go extinct in 100 million years. It's like, well, probably we won't worry about that. And if you can't specify the time frame, then you have a useless hypothesis. And a man named Julian Simon actually forced Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb, into a corner because he bet him, and a famous bet, that by the year 2000, not only would there not be mass starvation, which there obviously wasn't, but that commodities would get cheaper rather than becoming more expensive. And he let Ehrlich, the biologist, pick the commodities, and Simon won the bet. And Tupy has extended that work to a basket of 50 commodities and has demonstrated now that each child born produces 7 times as much wealth as they consume. So enough with there are too many people on the planet, and human beings are a destructive force, and all male will is nothing but a cancer on the planet and part of the oppressive patriarchy. It's like, that's all. There isn't a shred of evidence for any of that, except that when human systems degenerate, which they do fairly frequently, they degenerate in the direction of allowance for the expression of power, arbitrary compulsion. And so if your marriage disintegrates, you're going to start playing power games with each other. If your friendships disintegrate, same thing. Relationships between children and parents, if they're not optimized, they degenerate into power games. Same in business organizations. and political communities. But the fact that our social systems can degenerate into power games doesn't mean that that's what they're predicated on. And I think the evidence, so Frans de Waal, great primatologist, has been studying chimpanzees for a very long time, and chimps have a patriarchal social structure in that the primary structure of a status relationship in the troop is male. There's female hierarchy as well, but the males are predominant, superordinate, unlike the bonobos, by the way, which are closely related. There's a trope that Marxist biologists established that hierarchies are dominance hierarchies, and the dominance hierarchy is dominated by the most dominant male, and that implies the male who's most willing to use arbitrary force and compulsion. But de Waal has shown very clearly that, well, that sometimes even the smallest male can become the alpha if he has, for example, the support of an older female who has very good social connections within the troop, and if he's extremely good at reciprocal interactions and reconciliation post-conflict. And that what establishes peace and tranquility and prosperity, let's say, among chimpanzees is peacemaking and reconciliation, friendship essentially, maybe something like the spirit of voluntary play, and an optimally structured social system from the microcosm, say, husband and wife, to the macrocosm, a large corporation or a state, to the degree that that's governed by the spirit of voluntary association and even play, then it's optimized, as Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, was at pains to establish too. So not only are we not governed by the satanic expression of power dooming us to a kind of authoritarian hell, what we're properly governed by is something like the spirit of voluntary play. And so that's all good, that's all necessary to know for young men, because they're taught so often that their ambition is somehow intrinsically corrupt, and the best thing they could do is just, slough off into a corner and maybe die without making too much noise. I had a friend who committed suicide really because he believed that. It took him like 20 years to die. It was pretty painful to watch, but he definitely believed all that. He did everything he could to nullify himself. It was very painful. And so this happens a lot. And then the other thing that accompanies it is, well, men who quell themselves to that degree also suffer the shadow problem, which is all the unlived life, ambition, aggression within them, sexual desire, that just goes underground. And then, well, that's what accounts in part for these explosive, violent crimes. Certainly accounts for a lot of gang crime, because gang crime, that's been established beyond a shadow of a doubt, is all status jockeying. So, and of course, men are unbelievably motivated by status concerns, because women primarily choose men on the basis of their perceived status. That's a bit misleading, because women actually use status as a marker for productive generosity. So if you have to sum someone up quick, you might think, well, does he have resources? But the women aren't, unless they're unsophisticated, they're not really interested so much in the resources, although that's not nothing. What they're interested in is the ability to generate the resources, because that's a much better resource than just resources. Because you could have a useless guy who inherited a lot of money, as opposed, say, to a guy who doesn't have a lot of money but whose prospects are bright. And a sensible woman will take the latter guy over the former, and certainly be in much better condition to have a sustainable and enjoyable relationship. So women often get a bad rap, especially from people in the manosphere, so-called, for being hypergamous, which means mating across and up socioeconomic hierarchies, because women have a preference for men, young women, who are about 4 years older than them, who are as well off or better off than they are. And it's a female calibration mechanism to remediate the inequality placed on women in relationship to pregnancy and infant care. So a woman takes a vicious hit in terms of productivity when she becomes pregnant and has an infant. And so it's in her appropriate interest to find a man who can fill that gap.